It was past midnight in the laboratory, and the building was almost completely silent. Only one light was still on. A young scientist stood alone in front of a glowing screen, staring at a result that made no sense. He had repeated the experiment many times before, and the setup was simple. A device fired tiny particles toward a barrier with two narrow openings. Behind the barrier was a detector that recorded where the particles landed. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just clean science. But what appeared on the screen that night felt impossible. When the particles were not being watched, they'd be like waves of energy, spreading out and forming a soft pattern on the detector. But when a sensor was turned on to observe which opening each particle passed through, the pattern changed completely. The waves disappeared. The particles behaved like small, solid objects. The same particles, the same equipment, the same room. Only one difference: they were being observed. The scientist leaned closer to the screen. His heart beat slightly faster now. He turned the sensor off. The wave pattern returned. He turned it on again. The particles acted solid. It was as if the particles knew they were being watched, as if reality itself was responding to attention. He stepped back, confused, almost uneasy. How could something so small change its behavior just because someone was looking? How could observation shape the outcome of a physical event? He had learned that science was objective, that the universe followed clear rules, that matter behaved the same whether a human was present or not. But this experiment suggested something different. It suggested that awareness might matter. The room felt different now, heavier somehow. The scientist looked at his own hands, solid, steady, real. At least they seemed real. He remembered what atoms really are. Every object, every person, every wall in that lab is made of atoms. And atoms are mostly empty space. If an atom were the size of a stadium, the nucleus would be a tiny marble at the center, and everything else would be space filled with invisible energy. The solid matter is not truly solid. It is energy vibrating at certain frequencies. That means his hands are not solid in the way they appear. The floor beneath him is not solid. Even the walls around him are fields of moving energy. He slowly sat down in his chair, staring at the screen again. If tiny particles change when observed, what does that say about the world? And more importantly, what does that say about him? He had always believed he was a body made of matter, a fixed object moving through a solid world. But if everything at the deepest level is energy, then what is he really? Is he just matter arranged in a certain way? Or is he something more fluid, more dynamic, more connected to the invisible forces beneath reality? A strange thought entered his mind. What if the experiment was not just showing how particles behave? What if it was showing something about the role of the observer? What if consciousness is not just watching reality, but quietly shaping it? The idea felt dangerous, almost too big to hold. If observation changes the physical world at the smallest scale, then attention might be more powerful than anyone imagined. And if he is made of the same energy as those particles, then he is not separate from the experiment. He is part of it. The scientist turned off the lights in the lab, leaving only the soft glow of the detector screen. In that quiet moment, one question echoed in his mind. What happens the day a person stops seeing themselves as solid matter and starts seeing themselves as energy? Does reality remain the same, or does it begin to respond in ways we have never fully understood? And as the screen continued to flicker with patterns of waves and particles, the mystery felt less like a problem to solve and more like an invitation. The next morning, the scientist returned to the lab with a quiet determination. He could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The particles had changed when observed, but something else had changed too. His certainty. For years, he had trusted what his senses told him. The table is solid. The floor is solid. His body is solid. That was the foundation of his world. But now, he began to question that foundation. He opened his notebook and began reviewing what he already knew about atoms. Everything around him was made of them. Atoms formed molecules. Molecules formed cells. Cells formed his body. Simple, structured, logical. But when he looked deeper, the simplicity disappeared. An atom is almost entirely empty space. At its center is a tiny nucleus. Around it, electrons move so fast they appear like a cloud. If the nucleus were the size of a small marble placed in the center of a football stadium, the electrons would circle near the outer seats. Everything in between would be empty space. And yet that empty space is not truly empty. It is filled with energy fields, invisible forces holding everything together. He pressed his hand against the table. It felt hard and unmovable, but he knew the truth now. His hand was made of atoms. The table was made of atoms. What he felt as solid was not two solid objects touching. It was energy fields pushing against each other, tiny electrical forces preventing atoms from passing through one another. The feeling of solidity was an interaction of energy, not solid matter colliding with solid matter. He leaned back in his chair, trying to absorb the meaning of this. If his body was mostly empty space, structured by energy, then what exactly was he? He looked at his reflection in the dark computer screen. A face stared back at him, familiar and defined, but beneath the skin, beneath the muscles and bones, was movement, vibration, constant motion. Nothing in his body was truly still. Atoms vibrated, cells worked, energy flowed. He realized something unsettling. The idea of being a fixed, solid thing was an illusion created by perception. His senses translated energy into images and textures. His brain created the experience of solidity, but at the deepest level, everything was dynamic. He stood up and walked across the room. Each step felt firm, stable, real. Yet he now understood that stability was not the absence of motion. It was balance within motion. Energy arranged in patterns so consistent that they appeared solid. This changed the way he saw everything. The walls were not rigid barriers. There was structured energy. The air was not empty. It was alive with invisible particles and waves. Even his own thoughts, he realized, were electrical signals, tiny bursts of energy moving through neural pathways. So not only his body, but even his mind operated through energy. A quiet question formed within him. If he was not truly solid matter, but organized energy, then were his limits as solid as he believed? Was his fear solid? Was his doubts solid? Were his beliefs fixed, or were they patterns of energy too, capable of shifting and changing? He felt both small and expanded at the same time. Small, because he was just a collection of atoms in a vast universe. Expanded, because those atoms were made of the same energy that filled the stars. For the first time, he did not just understand this idea intellectually, he felt it. He was not a separate block of matter moving through a dead world. He was part of a living field of energy, constantly interacting, constantly exchanging. And if everything was energy, then perhaps the experiment from the night before was not strange at all. Perhaps it was simply revealing a deeper rule of reality. Energy responds to interaction, energy responds to attention, and slowly, a new possibility began to form in his mind. If matter is not as solid as it seems, then maybe reality itself is more flexible than anyone has dared to imagine. The scientist could not ignore the experiment any longer. The idea that matter was mostly energy was already unsettling, but the deeper mystery was still waiting. Why did the particles change when observed? He returned to the data from the double-slit experiment, studying each pattern carefully. When no one measured which path the particle took, a wave pattern appeared on the screen. It was soft, spread out, almost beautiful. But the moment a detector was placed to observe the path, the wave pattern collapsed. The particles behaved like tiny solid dots. Observation changed the outcome. This was not a mistake, not a theory without proof. The experiment had been repeated for decades, in different labs, by different scientists. The results were always the same. Something about observation mattered. He asked himself a simple but dangerous question. What counts as observation? Is it the machine that detects the particle? Is it the act of measurement itself? Or is it the awareness behind the measurement? Some scientists argued that it was only interaction, that the detector physically disturbed the particle. Others suggested something stranger, that information itself, the knowing of the path, was enough to change behavior. He sat quietly, imagining the tiny particle moving toward the barrier. Before it was observed, it behaved like a wave. A wave does not choose one path. It spreads out, exploring many possibilities at once. But when observed, it chose one path, one position, one outcome. It was as if reality shifted from possibility into certainty the moment it was seen. This idea unsettled him deeply. If at the smallest level reality exists as probabilities, as waves of potential, then when does it become fixed? When does maybe turn into is? The math described the process clearly, but the meaning behind it remained mysterious. He looked around the lab, at the equipment, the walls, the quiet machines humming softly. All of it appeared solid and stable, but at the deepest level, It was built from the same uncertain particles. Were they also waves of possibility until observed? Was the world less fixed than it appeared? He remembered something else. His thoughts were electrical activity in his brain. Electrical activity is energy, so even the act of thinking was part of this energetic universe. That meant the observer was not separate from what was being observed. He was made of the same substance as the particles, energy observing energy. The idea felt almost poetic, yet it was grounded in physics. The observer effect did not prove that the mind magically controls reality, but it did show that observation and outcome are connected, and that connection was impossible to ignore. He imagined a simple example. In daily life, when a person focuses on something, it grows in importance. When attention moves away, it fades. Attention shapes experience. Was this only psychological? Or was it a reflection of a deeper rule woven into the structure of reality? The scientists felt the weight of the question. If awareness plays a role in shaping physical events at the smallest scale, then consciousness may not be a passive witness. It may be an active participant, not outside the universe, but woven into it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint pattern on the detector screen. Before observation, the particle existed as possibility. After observation, it became fact, and slowly, a powerful thought formed in his mind. What if human life works in a similar way? What if possibilities surround every moment, and awareness helps collapse them into reality? He did not yet have answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The universe was not as simple as solid objects moving through empty space. It was a dance of energy, possibility, and observation, and somehow, he was part of that dance. Part 4. The inner shift. Seeing himself as energy that night, the scientist did not return to the lab. Instead, he sat alone in his apartment. The lights dim, the city quiet outside his window. The experiment was no longer just data on a screen. It had followed him home. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. For most of his life, he had thought of himself as a solid body, a fixed identity, a defined shape, a person with limits. But now, that idea felt incomplete. If his body was made of atoms, and atoms were mostly empty space, held together by energy, then he was not a solid object. He was movement. He was vibration arranged in patterns. He placed his hand over his chest and felt his heartbeat. Each beat was electrical signals firing through muscle tissue. Each thought in his mind was a pulse of energy traveling between neurons. Even his emotions were chemical and electrical processes. Energy in motion. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. The walls, the furniture, the air, all of it made of the same invisible fields. For the first time, he did not feel separate from the world around him. He felt connected to it, not as a poetic idea, but as a physical truth. The same energy that formed the stars formed his body. The same forces that shaped galaxies held together his atoms. A quiet shift began inside him. If he was energy, then perhaps he was not as fixed as he believed. Energy can change form. It can move. It can transform. It can flow from one state to another. He thought about his fears. They had always felt heavy and solid, like walls blocking his path. But what if fear was also energy? A pattern that could shift. He thought about his past mistakes. They had felt permanent. But if everything is dynamic, then nothing is completely frozen in time. Even identity could be flexible. He noticed something subtle happening within him. His problems did not disappear, but they felt less solid, less like unmovable objects, more like temporary waves passing through. When he saw himself as matter, life felt heavy, bound by physical limits and rigid definitions. But when he saw himself as energy, something opened. Possibility. If he was energy interacting with a field of energy, then every moment was interaction. Every thought was influence. Every choice was movement within the field. He stood up and walked to the window. The city lights flickered in the distance. Each light represented lives, stories, minds, thinking their own thoughts. All of them made of the same energetic fabric. For the first time, he felt less like a separate object in a crowded world, and more like a wave within a vast ocean. Distinct, yet not disconnected. A simple realization formed clearly in his mind. If a person believes they are only solid matter, they may feel trapped by circumstances. But if a person understands they are dynamic energy, they may begin to see change as natural, growth as possible, transformation as part of their nature. He did not claim that reality would magically bend to his wishes, but he sensed that perception itself had power. Seeing himself differently changed how he felt, how he thought, how he imagined his future. And if thoughts influenced actions, and actions shape outcomes, then this inner shift was not small. It was the beginning of something deeper. As he stood there in the quiet room, one thought echoed gently within him. Maybe the greatest change does not begin in the outer world. Maybe it begins in the moment a person realizes they are not solid matter moving through a fixed reality, but living energy participating in a universe that is still unfolding. The next day, the scientist returned to the lab with a calmer mind. He had felt the inner shift, but now he needed to be honest with himself. Was this just a feeling, or was something deeper happening? He stood again before the detector screen, watching particles leave their quiet traces of light. They still behaved the same way. When observed, they formed solid patterns. When not observed, they spread like waves. The universe had not suddenly changed overnight. The laws of physics were still there, steady and reliable. So he asked himself a careful question. Does seeing himself as energy actually bend reality, or does it simply change how he moves within it? He knew one thing clearly. Perception shapes behavior. When a person believes they are weak and limited, they act carefully. They avoid risk. They expect failure. They prepare for disappointment. And often, their results match those expectations. But when a person believes they are capable, adaptable, and connected, they act differently. They take chances. They recover faster. They look for solutions instead of barriers. Different actions create different outcomes. This was not magic. It was cause and effect. He realized something important. Maybe reality does not bend like a spoon in a fantasy story. Maybe it bends in quieter ways, through attention, through belief, through choice. He thought about attention again. In the experiment, observation changed the behavior of particles. In daily life, attention changes experience. What a person focuses on grows stronger in their awareness. Focus on fear, and fear expands. Focus on possibility, an opportunity becomes visible. The external world may not instantly transform, but the path a person walks through that world does. He began to see that the idea of being energy was not about controlling the universe. It was about understanding participation. He was not a passive object in a fixed system. He was an active process within a living field. His thoughts were energy. His emotions were energy. His actions were energy in motion, and energy always interacts. He considered another simple truth. Energy cannot be destroyed. It only changes form. If that law applies to stars and atoms, it applies to him too. That thought alone shifted something. Inside him, failure no longer felt final. Fear no longer felt permanent. Even challenges felt more like forces to move with, rather than walls to crash into. He began to understand that reality might not bend because he wishes it to, but it responds to how he shows up within it. If he shows up as rigid matter, he meets resistance. If he shows up as flexible energy, he adapts, and adaptation changes outcomes. The shift was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but inside, it was powerful. He was no longer asking, can I control reality? He was asking, how am I participating in it? That question felt more grounded, more honest, and strangely, more empowering. As he watched the tiny particles flash across the screen once more, he realized something quietly profound. Reality may not be a solid stage where life happens to him. It may be a dynamic field where life happens with him, and in that field, the way he sees himself matters. The laboratory was quiet again. The machines hummed softly. The detector screen glowed in the dark, showing patterns of waves and particles. The experiment had not changed, but he had. The scientist stood still, watching the tiny flashes of light appear and disappear. Each particle arrived as a possibility. Each measurement turned it into a result. Wave into particle, uncertainty into position, potential into fact. He no longer saw it as just a strange behavior of matter. He saw it as a mirror. At the deepest level, reality was not a collection of solid things frozen in place. It was movement. It was probability. It was energy waiting to interact. And somehow, observation played a role in that interaction. He looked down at his hands again. The same hands he had stared at nights before. They still looked solid. They still felt solid. But now he knew they were structured energy, organized into form. The same energy that danced as waves in the experiment flowed through his body, through his thoughts, through his awareness. A quiet realization settled inside him. He was not separate from the universe he studied. He was an expression of it. Energy, observing energy. For years, he had searched for answers outside himself, in data and equations, and those answers were still important. But now, he understood something deeper. The observer is not standing outside reality. The observer is part of it. Every moment of attention is participation. Every belief shapes perception. Every perception guides action. And action shapes experience. The shift was not loud. There was no dramatic explosion of light, no sudden bending of physical laws. The world outside the lab remained the same. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried through their routines. The stars burned quietly in the sky. But inside him, something had rearranged. He no longer felt like a small object trapped inside a massive universe. He felt like a wave within a vast ocean of energy, distinct, yet connected, limited in form, yet unlimited in essence. He understood now that reality might not instantly change when a person sees themselves as energy, but the way they move through reality does, and that movement matters. As he turned off the machine and the screen faded to black, one final question rose gently in his mind. If he was not simply solid matter, if he was living energy, participating in an unfolding universe, then who was he, really? Was he just a body shaped by forces, or was he also a field of awareness shaping how those forces expressed themselves? The experiment had not given him complete answers, but it had opened a door to a new way of seeing. And as he stepped out of the lab into the quiet night, he carried that question with him. If you were not only matter, but energy, what might shift the moment you truly realize it?